Well, this is the Insight Bureau with another Café Insights conversation, this time with Graeme Maxton, a business writer, business economist and advisor to international companies in Asia, and the author of a book which I know is keenly anticipated, entitled The End of Progress, which we will talk about later. So Graeme, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
I wanted to start off by asking, as we sit here in Singapore, surrounded by some of the fastest growing economies, business executives are very optimistic, at least. The sun's shining, in both senses of the word. You have a perspective as someone who spends time in both Europe and Asia. Is it safe to say the world's dodged the bullet in terms of surviving the global financial crisis, and are we out of the woods in terms of recession now?
I think it's very easy to look at the situation of the last 18 months and say, well, the recession's over. We've seen this big bounce back. But what I want to say is, well, of course it looks better. We've seen huge amounts of government cash invested in the economy to try and boost the recovery. And we've seen certainly the stock markets bouncing back partly as a result of that. But in reality, in the West and in Europe, there's still so much debt. There's bank debt, there's now consumer debt, and of course there's all this new government debt as well. And so for the economies there, no, I don't think we're out of the woods. But for Asia, sure. I mean, this is the booming region of the world, and it will continue to be the booming region of the world for years to come.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering... Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the business executives here are certainly very positive and have all the numbers to back it up. I mean, they're doing very, very well. Are we kind of talking about a two tracks world now?
I don't think so, not completely. I mean, Asia clearly has its own momentum, and I was speaking at a conference this week on the shipping industry, and they're saying that most of the shipping these days, the growth is intra-Asia, it's countries within Asia. So there is a sort of sense of belief that Asia has decoupled. But it's still the fact that the biggest export markets for China are still Europe and the US, right, and they will remain very important export markets. So we're going to see its own momentum beginning to grow in Asia, and it will remain the engine of growth for the world, but it's not going to be the pace of growth that we've seen before, because there's going to be a dragging effect of Europe and the US.
But I think that it's right to compare and contrast, because you've got such debt in the West, where a lot of Asian economies have great reserves. We're seeing, the danger of deflation in parts of the West, or we were until recently. Yet, inflation getting out of hand, perhaps even in some high growth, overheating economies of Asia. We're seeing unemployment in the West, and can't get enough good talent in the East. So I think it is. People will naturally compare and say, do we have two worlds?
Yes, and as I say, I mean, Asia is going to be much more of a sort of sense of opportunity, but everybody sees that. And so you're going to see a lot of people pouring in here, which is going to increase the level of activity, make it much more competitive. You're going to see commodities prices continuing to rise because of the demand in the region, and so there'll be inflation in terms of the raw materials costs, in terms of wage costs. I mean, there are a lot of concerns. But still, if you have to invest anywhere, although it's going to be tough, Asia is still going to be much more attractive than Europe or the US in the next decade.
Okay. Well, let's turn to the book then. The End of Progress, How Modern Economics Has Failed Us. I'm sure that a lot of people are going to be intrigued by this title. I know you. I know this is typical of you in terms of being challenging and provocative. But what are you really setting out to achieve in writing this?
I almost feel slightly evangelistic about this. I have a strong belief that I want to make people stop and think, and more than that, I want to change the way they're behaving. We have an economic path which is, I think, leading in the wrong direction. We've become obsessed with growth. We've become obsessed with profit, and because of this growth, we've become overladen in the West with debt, and that is going to cause all sorts of problems going forward. It's also causing problems with our resource use in the world. We're using the world's resources up far too quickly and not thinking about future generations. I want us to step back and think about some of the original principles about the way Adam Smith intended economics to be, about a socially responsible level of development, and not just thinking about growth and profit.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have kind of fixated with the notion that economic growth equals progress, but I think you challenge that. I know that you've compared the Renaissance period in Europe as being a wonderful, rich period, and almost despair now. They think we're entering a period of endarkment. That seems quite a bleak view of the future?
I mean, it doesn't have to be bleak. I mean, today, when you talk to people in Europe and the US, and increasingly in Asia too, there's a sense of material goods being the most important measure of progress. I have to have the latest iPhone. I have to have the latest car. I have to have a new house. I have to have a new watch. There's a great material drive in all of us, and that wasn't the case if you go back even 30 years ago. There was much more of a sense of wanting to have technological developments, of science, of art, of literature, of family being more important. And I just think we need to move the balance back slightly again, to look at more broadly and not just think about what we have in our cupboards and what we can spend our money on.
Is it a choice or is it inevitable? I mean, are we going to be forced into this position anyway, or is it, a more holistic consideration?
It's a very good question. It's ultimately going to be forced on us because the way we're achieving this obsession with material items is through debt in the West. We're borrowing too much. That's not the case in Asia, although it's increasingly the case in some parts of Asia, particularly places like South Korea. But more than that, we're going to have to come back to balance because of resources. That although there's plenty of oil left in the world, there's plenty of gas, there's plenty of copper and zinc, we're using it up at such a rate that we're going to run into resource constraints within a few decades. And we're already running up against resource constraints with things like water and food, which is why commodity prices are going up. So we're going to be forced to change whether we like it or not. And what I'm trying to say is, let's think about it now. Let's make the changes now before they're forced upon us, because they will be much more difficult.
Right. I mean, back to the reference about modern economics. Having failed us, I mean, this is probably going to get you in a little bit of hot water with some economists around the world. What are you really saying, that markets shouldn't necessarily be left to themselves? I mean, free market notion of laissez-faire is all wrong, and or is it just out of date, or it needs modification?
I think we've changed the way we understand laissez-faire. Adam Smith was very keen on open markets and free trade and laissez-faire approach. But what he did not say is that we should be completely open in our markets. He didn't say that we should have no regulation. And if you think about what's been happening in the last few years, and let's just take the banking sector in particular, we've seen this bubble of debt build up, and the central banks in the US and Europe didn't do anything about it. They saw this problem arising, but because they believed that the market would fix it, they did nothing. And then we have this crisis, which started in 2007, which has caused all this debt, and you can see that policy didn't work. So I think economics has failed us in the sense that it has given us a belief that we don't need to regulate complicated systems.
Right.
It's also failed us in the sense that it's given us a belief that the measure of development is economic growth, and that is dependent on consumption, and that's dependent on borrowing. And it's also failed us in the third way by underpricing our resources. We're selling our oil, our water, our natural resources like oil, like copper or wood, far below the real cost that's incurred. We're not accounting for the environmental damages, and we're not accounting for the cost of these resources not being there in future generations. And classical economics say we should be doing that.
So by not pricing in the externalities, we've essentially been subsidising our growth over the last decade or so.
Exactly. The people that are paying for our growth are often the poor, it's the environment, or the future generations. The fact that our grandchildren will have no oil is because we've been using it on the cheap.
I think the danger with this, when we're talking about countries like China, I mean, we're so thankful that Asia has been the only engine really. It's like a 747 with one engine still running to get us across the Atlantic or something, and now we're turning around to China and saying, we're worried about the rate of growth, this is just not sustainable, and that maybe we need to dampen things down. This is their chance to develop. This is their, pulling themselves out of poverty, yet we're saying, hang on a minute, we need to slow this down.
Yes, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for the sort of, I think, the anger that will grow in China over the next decades or so, because they've been sold a dream that cannot come true. There was a study done last year by the World Wildlife Fund that showed that in terms of resource use, we're currently living at a rate that requires 1.5 planet Earths. That we're already using more resources than the planet can withstand. Now, if we carry on that way, then clearly we have a problem. But China and India and many other developed countries have been sold the dream of being able to live the way people do in the West, to live the way people do in America or in Europe. Now, the World Wildlife Study also showed that if China achieves that level of standard of living, then we need 4 planet Earths. Now that's simply impossible.
Yes.
And so at some point we're going to have this clash between expectation of the developing world, and reality, that cannot come true. And unless we handle those expectations, unless we manage the resources better, we're going to come into some sort of clash.
Right. So really it seems to me like your mission is to grab people by the shoulder and give them a shake, you know, just to say, well, you know, get them to question assumptions, and really face up to the challenges, and make some, you know, changes which are to some degree inevitable. Are you optimistic that that's going to happen?
That's clearly a very difficult question. I'd like to be optimistic, and I am optimistic in the sense that I think if we don't make a change, then the risks are very large. We risk conflict between the peoples of the world over water, over oil, over coal, over uranium, and all sorts of other resources, and particularly over food and water, as we're seeing already. We risk rising levels of sickness with climate change, and again with shortages of food and water, and we risk potentially even war. So there's a great deal at stake here. Why do I think that we have an opportunity to change it for then? Well, because the risks are so great. I feel, as I said at the beginning, evangelical about this. I feel I have to get this message out there. I want people to think about it. I want them to change, and that's why I've written this book.
Graeme Maxton, intriguing, fascinating. Thanks very, very much.
Thank you.